This happened a couple of winters ago. I was living alone for the first time in a small rental house in Ballard, a quiet neighborhood in Seattle. I'd moved there after a pretty rough breakup and figured the peace and quiet would be good for me. It all started on a Sunday evening. I was putting up a few Christmas decorations, trying to make the place feel a little warmer. The neighborhood was mostly families and older couples, so everything was pretty quiet. I'd noticed a few people out walking dogs or putting up lights, but I didn't know anyone yet. Around 9 or so, I was in the living room adjusting the tree lights when I noticed a man standing across the street. At first, I thought he was maybe waiting for someone or just taking a break from a walk. He was looking in my direction, but not necessarily at me. I brushed it off, but after a few minutes I glanced up again, and he was still there, staring. It was strange because he hadn't moved an inch. I figured I'd just ignore it and go about my night. After all, it was probably nothing. But when I checked again, he'd moved closer, standing on the sidewalk directly in front of my house. That's when my stomach started to knot up. I went around the house, locking all the doors and making sure the windows were secure, even though he was outside. I closed the curtains in the living room, but I kept peeking through the edge, watching him. Eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, he walked away down the street and disappeared into the dark. I thought that would be the end of it, and I tried to brush it off as just some weird encounter. But the next night, around the same time, he showed up again. This time, he didn't stand across the street. He went directly up to my window and just stared in. I didn't even want to breathe, afraid he'd see me. I tried to convince myself to be rational, telling myself it was probably just someone confused or lost, but every fiber in me was screaming that this wasn't normal. I managed to grab my phone and I debated calling the police, but then he turned and walked away before I could decide what to do. I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling a strange combination of relief and dread. I wanted to think it was over, but a part of me just knew he'd be back. Sure enough, on the third night, he was back again, earlier this time. He was just there, standing motionless on the other side of my window, looking straight in. I couldn't understand what he wanted or why he was targeting me. The way he looked at the house felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something. Every time I moved even a little, his eyes would shift ever so slightly, like he was aware of every tiny movement. It was the most unsettling thing I'd ever experienced. The next morning, I woke up to find faint smudges on the outside of the window where he'd been standing. They looked like handprints, but they were smeared, almost like he'd dragged his fingers down the glass. My mind started racing with questions. Had he been trying to see through the curtains? Was he testing the window, trying to find a way in? I was officially freaked out. I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. What would I even say? I ended up installing an extra lock on the front door and buying a small security camera that I set up facing the living room window from the inside. I told myself I'd catch him on camera if he showed up again, and at least I'd have something to give to the police. For the next few days, he didn't show up. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe it was over, but a part of me kept watching that window every night, waiting. Then, just when I started to let my guard down, he came back. This time, he was bolder. I had gone to bed, trying to sleep off the stress of the past few nights, when I heard a sound coming from the front of the house. It was a light tapping, almost like someone was knocking but too softly for anyone else to hear. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and persistent. Eventually, I forced myself to go to the window in the living room to check, hoping it was just some animal or branch against the glass. He was standing there again, closer than ever, his face only inches from the window. I froze. I could see his face clearly for the first time. He looked middle-aged, with pale skin and dark, sunken eyes. There was no expression on his face, just a cold, empty look, like he was staring straight through me. I backed away slowly, but his eyes followed me, tracking every small movement. I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, but I felt trapped. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the thought of him standing outside, watching. I spent the whole night like that, lying awake and waiting for the slightest sound. The next morning, I was exhausted. I decided it was time to talk to the police, even though I felt silly not having done it sooner. I sent an officer out who listened to my story and took some notes, but when he looked around, he couldn't find any evidence of the man, No prints, no scuff marks, nothing. I showed him the footage from my security camera, but all it had captured was a vague outline in the dark. The officer was polite, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. He suggested that I stay inside and keep the doors locked, which felt like the bare minimum. The nights felt endless after that. I kept my curtains closed, but I still couldn't help peeking out, terrified that I'd see him again. I started sleeping with all the lights on, and every small sound made me jump. I checked my phone constantly, even though I knew it wouldn't change anything. I was stuck in a cycle of fear, dreading nightfall but feeling helpless to do anything about it. After about a week of silence, I thought maybe it was finally over. I started leaving the curtains open again during the day, trying to let some light in and convince myself that everything was fine. I began to relax just a little, and life felt almost normal. But then on Christmas Eve, something happened that still haunts me. I'd been out running errands, trying to keep busy and distract myself. When I got home, I noticed a small envelope wedged into the frame of my front door. There was no stamp, no address, just my name written in shaky handwriting. I tore it open, my heart pounding. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it were 4 words written in that same handwriting. See you tonight. I dropped the note, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The fact that he'd been close enough to leave it there without me noticing made my skin crawl. That night, I sat in the middle of my living room, every light on, clutching my phone, waiting for something to happen. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see his face peering in again. But there was nothing. The hours dragged by, and I felt myself getting more and more exhausted, but I refused to sleep. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the faint sound of footsteps outside. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The sound was soft, almost like someone was trying not to be heard, moving slowly around the side of the house. I sat there in the dark, listening, unable to do anything but hope he'd go away. The footsteps stopped outside the window, and then there was a light tap on the glass, just once, barely a sound. I stared at the window, praying he wouldn't try to come in. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again, retreating into the distance. The next morning, I found another handprint on the window, right where his face had been. I don't know why he stopped coming after that night, but I haven't seen him since. This happened a few years ago. I had just moved into my first house in a quiet part of Cleveland, in a neighborhood called Tremont. It's the kind of place where people mostly keep to themselves but are friendly enough, waving when you pass by. It was an older, historic neighborhood, and the houses had a lot of charm. I felt pretty good about it, and I figured a quiet holiday season was exactly what I needed. I've always loved decorating for Christmas. Growing up, it was a big deal in my family, so now that I had a house, I wanted to do it right. I spent a whole weekend putting up lights around the roof, wrapping some around the porch railing, and staking a few into the front yard. I even bought a couple of glowing reindeer to place in the yard. The display wasn't huge or flashy, just enough to bring a bit of cheer to the place. The neighborhood was quiet, with only a few other houses decorated, so mine definitely stood out a bit. But nobody seemed to mind. It was around 10 p.m., and I was about to head to bed when I noticed a note on my doorstep. It was a piece of paper folded over once and placed neatly right outside my front door. I figured maybe it was from a neighbor, so I picked it up and opened it. The handwriting was messy, like a child's, with thick, uneven letters. It just said, "Turn off the lights or we will." I stood there, holding the note, trying to process what it meant. I thought maybe it was a joke, like some kid playing a prank. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't sit right. The handwriting didn't seem playful. It felt weirdly direct, almost like a demand. But I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. I left the lights on and went to bed, trying not to let it bother me. The next morning, I went outside and saw that my lights had been unplugged. The extension cord was still lying in the yard, but it had been yanked out from the outlet on the porch. I was a little creeped out, but I thought maybe the cord had just gotten loose. I plugged everything back in and tried not to think about it. I figured if it happened again, I'd put some kind of lock on the outlet. That night, everything was fine. I went to bed around the same time, double-checking that the lights were on and securely plugged in. But when I went outside the next morning, they were unplugged again. This time, the extension cord was coiled neatly and placed right on my doorstep, almost like someone wanted me to notice it. At this point, I was feeling uneasy. I told myself it could still be some neighborhood kids messing around, but the way the cord was placed, it just didn't feel like a prank. It felt more deliberate. I decided to set up an old camera I had, aiming it toward the front yard to try and catch whoever was doing it. I figured if I got it on video, maybe I'd feel more at ease, or at least have something to show the police if things got weirder. The camera recorded that night without a hitch. I went out in the morning, half expecting the lights to be unplugged again, but they were still on. I felt a bit of relief, thinking maybe whoever it was had given up, but I still checked the footage, just in case. At first, everything seemed normal. The camera showed the empty yard, nothing but my lights glowing in the dark. But around 2 a.m., a shadow appeared at the edge of the screen. It was a group of people, maybe 3 or 4, all wearing dark clothes with hoods pulled over their heads. They were standing just outside the reach of the lights, at the very edge of my yard. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. After a few minutes, one of them stepped forward, slowly, and unplugged the lights. Then they all turned and walked away without saying a word or looking back. I watched that video over and over, trying to figure out what their deal was. Why would a group of people go through all that trouble just to unplug Christmas lights? It didn't make any sense. I was definitely creeped out, but I didn't want to overreact. I figured maybe it was some kind of protest or prank, and they'd eventually get bored and stop. But the next night they were back. This time I didn't sleep. I stayed up, watching from my window, determined to catch them in the act. I sat in the dark, staring out at the yard, barely even blinking. Sure enough, right around 2 a.m., they appeared again, stepping into the glow of the lights, faces still hidden under their hoods. One of them walked forward, and like before, unplugged the lights. But instead of walking away, they just stood there in the yard, looking up at my window. I felt a chill run down my spine, knowing they could probably see me watching. They didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, staring up at the house for what felt like an eternity. Finally they left, disappearing into the shadows like before. I waited a few minutes, my heart racing, then went out to plug the lights back in. My hands were shaking, but I was determined not to let them get to me. I'd caught them on camera again, this time with a clearer view. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That a group of people were unplugging my lights and staring at my window? It sounded so minor, even though I knew it wasn't. The next night, I decided to turn off the lights. I figured maybe if they didn't see them on, they wouldn't come back. I hated feeling like I was giving in, but I was honestly scared. I didn't want another night of watching them stand in my yard staring. I went to bed in the dark, hoping that would be the end of it. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a soft, rhythmic tapping sound. I sat up in bed listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It was coming from the front of the house near the window. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was knocking but not in any hurry. I sat there, paralyzed, not wanting to move or even breathe. I thought about looking out the window, but I was terrified of what I might see. The tapping went on for a few more minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stayed in bed, wide awake, until the sun came up. In the morning I found another note on my doorstep. It was written in the same messy handwriting as before, but this time it simply said, "We warned you." I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police, explaining everything that had happened, from the notes to the people in the yard to the tapping. The officer who came out was sympathetic, but didn't seem too concerned. He walked around the property, found nothing unusual, and basically told me to keep the lights off if they were bothering someone. It felt like he was brushing it off, and that only made me feel more uneasy. For the rest of the holiday season, I didn't turn the lights back on. Every night, I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked, and I tried to go to sleep without thinking about it. I didn't see the group again, and eventually, things started to feel normal. But that tapping sound still haunts me. Someone took a creepy photo of me while I was dressed as Santa. A few years back, I volunteered to be Santa at a holiday fair in my hometown, Austin, Texas. I'd done it a couple of times before for some extra cash, and it was usually a lot of fun. Kids would sit on my lap, ask for the latest toys, parents would snap photos, and everyone was in a good mood. It wasn't a big event, just a small, local thing in the park with a few food stalls and Christmas lights. That night, I arrived at around 5 p.m., suited up in the classic red outfit with a fake beard, and settled into my chair for photos. I sat on this little raised platform with Christmas decorations all around, and a line of parents and kids formed pretty quickly. Everything went smoothly for the first couple of hours. The kids were happy, the parents were snapping away on their phones, and I was doing my best Santa laugh. Then, as the evening wore on, the crowd started to thin out. Around 8:30 or so, I decided to take a break. My back was sore, and I was honestly ready to stretch out a bit. I got up, walked over to the area near the bathrooms, and leaned against a tree for a few minutes. The fairground was dimly lit, but there were enough lights around the booths and decorations that it didn't feel creepy or anything. I just wanted a moment to myself to breathe and maybe check my phone. That's when I felt this strange sensation, like someone was looking at me. I looked around, but the area seemed pretty empty. There were a few people wandering around, but none of them were paying me any attention. I brushed it off and just scrolled through my phone for a bit before heading back. The rest of the night was uneventful, and I wrapped up around 10. I got out of the Santa suit, collected my things, and went home, exhausted but happy to have helped out. It was only when I was relaxing on my couch, looking through the photos I'd taken earlier in the day, that I noticed something strange. I don't even remember taking this one particular photo. It was a close-up of my face, but not in a fun, selfie kind of way. It was taken from just a few feet away, maybe less. My face looked tired, and I wasn't smiling or posing. I was just looking off into the distance, completely unaware of the camera. There was something unsettling about seeing myself like that. Like someone had caught me in a moment of complete vulnerability. I checked the timestamp. It had been taken during my break, while I was leaning against that tree. My heart started pounding because I was sure I hadn't taken it. I had my phone in my hand, but I definitely didn't take any photos. I started to think maybe someone had used my phone while I wasn't paying attention, but that didn't make any sense either. I had been holding it the entire time. I tried to shake it off, but I kept coming back to the image, zooming in and trying to figure out if there was anything unusual in the background. Nothing. Just a close-up of my face, looking completely drained. It was like someone had intentionally taken the shot to capture me at my most tired and unguarded. I knew I hadn't taken it, but there was no explanation for how it got there. The next day I kept my phone close and checked for anything unusual, but nothing happened. I went about my normal routine, though I felt on edge, as if I was waiting for something to happen. Later that week, I was scrolling through my photos again, just out of habit, and I saw that same image staring back at me. But this time, it was followed by another photo that hadn't been there before. The new photo was almost identical, another close-up of my face, but now I was looking directly into the camera. I could feel my stomach drop as I stared at it. I had no memory of this picture being taken, but my eyes were locked on the camera like I knew it was there. The same tired expression, but with a hint of something else. Something I couldn't quite place. I didn't remember looking into my phone like that, and I definitely didn't take the photo. I started to wonder if someone was messing with me. Maybe a friend had somehow managed to take the photos, though I didn't know how they'd done it without me noticing. But none of my friends even knew I was doing the Santa gig that night. I kept the phone on me constantly after that, hoping to catch something if it happened again. Then, one night, about a week later, I got a notification while I was out grabbing groceries. It was from my photo gallery, one of those automatic reminders to look at this day's memories. I opened it, half expecting to see the Santa photos. Instead, there was a new picture, taken that same night in the grocery store. It was another close-up of me, but this time it was taken from behind. I was looking at something on a shelf, completely unaware, and the angle made it clear it wasn't a selfie. My phone had been in my pocket when the photo was taken. I remember standing there in the middle of the store, just staring at the screen, trying to process how this was happening. I looked around, scanning the aisles to see if anyone was watching me, but the store was mostly empty. I felt exposed, like someone was following me, taking pictures without me ever knowing. I was already on edge, but this was different. It was one thing to find a weird photo in my phone, but this was a reminder that someone had been right behind me, close enough to get that shot. I didn't stick around. I left the groceries, got into my car, and drove home as quickly as I could. When I got home, I went through every single app on my phone, checking for any sign of hacking or a malfunction. I even called a friend who knew a bit about tech, and he suggested that maybe it was some kind of glitch with the camera. But that didn't make sense either. A glitch doesn't follow you around, taking pictures when you aren't looking. I started locking my phone with a password, hoping that would somehow stop it. But it didn't. Over the next few days, more photos showed up, all taken from strange angles, some of them in places I didn't even remember being. Some were close-ups of my face again, catching me off guard, looking exhausted or spaced out, like someone was trying to capture me in moments when I let my guard down. I was losing sleep, constantly checking my phone, scrolling through the gallery to make sure nothing new had appeared. I stopped going out alone, and every time I left the house, I'd feel like someone was right behind me, watching. Even though I never actually saw anyone, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were there, waiting to catch me in another unguarded moment. Eventually, I decided to get a new phone. I backed up my contacts and a few essentials, but left all the photos behind. I didn't want anything from that phone transferring over, afraid I'd somehow bring the weirdness with me. I thought maybe it was finally over, and for a while, it seemed like it was. Then, one morning, I woke up and reached for my new phone. As I unlocked the screen, I saw a notification from my gallery. It was a suggestion to look at my latest photos. I felt my heart racing as I opened it, hoping it was nothing. But there, staring back at me, was a close-up photo of my face, taken in the middle of the night. I'd been asleep, completely unaware. To this day, I have no idea who or what was taking those photos or how they ended up on my phone. It was late, probably around 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve. I'd been relaxing with a drink, watching a Christmas movie, just trying to enjoy the holiday. I'd spent most of the day alone, by choice, and was looking forward to a quiet evening. My family lived out of state, so I was used to spending Christmas on my own. It didn't really bother me. That's when I heard it. Faint singing coming from outside. At first, I thought maybe it was my neighbors, although I'd never known them to be the type to go caroling. I paused the movie, listening. The singing was soft, almost like it was being carried by the wind, but I could hear the tune of Silent Night. I got up, moved closer to the door, and it got louder, but not by much. I almost convinced myself that it was just coming from somewhere down the street. Then, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't loud, just a few quiet taps, like someone was trying to be polite but still wanted to be heard. I thought about ignoring it, but the singing was still going, and curiosity got the best of me. I figured maybe it was some people from the neighborhood who'd had a bit to drink and decided to spread some holiday cheer. I opened the door and found a small group standing on my porch. There were 4 of them, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned Christmas clothes, wool coats, scarves, hats, the works. They looked like they'd stepped out of some Victorian postcard. They weren't smiling, though. All 4 of them were staring at me with these blank expressions. Their eyes looked off, like they weren't really focused on me or anything around them, just empty. They started singing again, the same song, in the same low, monotone voices. It didn't sound like the Silent Night I was used to. It was slow, almost dragged out, and completely lifeless. There was no warmth or joy in it, just this cold, flat sound. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about it wasn't right. But I didn't want to be rude, so I just stood there, trying to give a polite nod, hoping they'd finish and move on. They kept singing, not moving, not blinking. It was like they were in a trance, or maybe they just weren't really there at all. I couldn't shake the sense that they were just wrong. There was nothing festive about them, no hint of kindness or friendliness, just those blank faces and that dead, unfeeling song. I was frozen, just staring back at them, and they didn't seem to notice or care. After what felt like an eternity, they stopped. The silence was even worse than the singing. They didn't say anything, didn't wish me a Merry Christmas, just stood there, staring at me in silence. I finally forced myself to mumble some kind of thanks, hoping they'd take the hint and leave. But they didn't move. They just kept standing there, looking at me with those empty eyes. I started to feel my chest tighten, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. Finally, one of them, a man who looked to be in his 50s, took a step forward. He had a scruffy, graying beard and deep-set eyes that seemed almost hollow. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of paper, folding it in half before holding it out to me. His hand was shaking, just a little, like he was cold or nervous. But his face never changed. I didn't want to take it, but I didn't know what else to do, so I reached out, trying not to let my hand brush his. As soon as I took the paper, they turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness down the street. I closed the door, locked it, and stood there in silence, staring at the paper in my hand. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking. I unfolded the paper, and in messy, almost childlike handwriting it said, "Join us next year." I couldn't understand it. Join them? And what? I spent the rest of the night pacing around, unable to shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see them standing outside, staring back at me. But there was nothing. Just an empty street, quiet and still. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was some kind of weird prank. I even tried looking up Christmas carolers in the area, but nothing came up. No local group, no event, nothing. It was as if they'd never existed. I went about my day trying to push it out of my mind, but the note stayed with me. I kept it in a drawer, thinking maybe I'd figure it out eventually. As the next Christmas approached, I started to feel anxious. I'd almost forgotten about the carolers, but every time I thought about putting up decorations or planning my holiday, that memory came flooding back. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was just some people having a laugh. But a part of me was on edge, waiting. On Christmas Eve, I made sure to keep all the lights off, thinking maybe that would discourage them if they showed up again. I sat in the living room, lights out, curtains closed, watching TV with the volume down low, trying to distract myself. But every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't stop glancing at the clock. Around the same time as the year before, a little after 10 p.m., I heard it. Faint singing, carrying through the silence. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stayed on the couch, listening, hoping they'd pass by. The singing grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my door. This time it was a different song, "We Wish You a Merry Christmas," but sung in that same slow, dead monotone. I sat there, paralyzed, listening to the muffled voices just feet away. The knock came, quiet and deliberate, just like before. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe, afraid that they'd somehow hear me. The singing continued, the knock repeating every few moments, like they were waiting for me to answer. I felt my throat tighten, my hands gripping the edge of the couch, wishing they'd just go away. Finally, after what felt like hours, the singing stopped. I stayed there, listening, barely daring to move. I waited, counting the seconds, then minutes, until I was sure they were gone. I got up slowly, tiptoeing over to the door and peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty. They were gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but as I stepped back, something caught my eye. A small piece of paper slid under the door. I stared at it for a long time before finally working up the courage to pick it up. My hands shook as I unfolded it, the same messy handwriting staring back at me. "Join us next year." I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that they were more than just carolers. I haven't spent a Christmas Eve in that house since, and I don't plan to. Every year I go out of town as far away as I can get, but I still think about them, standing there on my porch, waiting, and I wonder if they're out there somewhere, looking for someone else to join them. My Secret Santa gift was way too personal. This happened a couple of years ago, back when I had just started a new job in Boston. It was a pretty corporate office, the kind of place where everyone keeps to themselves and things stay professional. I'd only been there a few months when the holidays rolled around, and as a way to bring everyone together, the office organized a Secret Santa gift exchange. I wasn't thrilled about it since I didn't know many people there, but I figured it was an easy way to fit in, so I joined. They assigned each of us a name at random, and we had to leave our gifts anonymously on our assigned person's desk. My person was one of the senior guys in sales, someone I barely knew, but I found something generic that seemed right, and dropped it on his desk a couple of days before the holiday break. I assumed it would be simple and anonymous for everyone, just like the instructions had said. It was supposed to be lighthearted, just a small exchange, but things got strange for me really fast. On the last day before break, I came in to find a neatly wrapped box on my desk, smaller than a shoebox. The wrapping paper was festive, covered in snowflakes and little trees, and tied with a red ribbon. I remember smiling to myself, thinking it was a nice touch. Most of the gifts I'd seen around the office were hastily wrapped or just tossed into gift bags. I was actually a little excited to open it, expecting something like chocolates or a small candle, just something generic. But as soon as I lifted the lid, I felt my stomach turn. Inside was a framed photo of myself, taken from behind my desk, from an angle that showed my computer screen and a few personal items I kept on my desk. It was the exact setup of my desk, down to the pens and the sticky notes. The frame was cheap, something plain, and the photo itself was printed on standard paper, like someone had just printed it out quickly. There was a note taped to the back of the frame that simply said, "I watch you every day." I stood there, holding the photo, completely thrown off. I looked around the office, half expecting to see someone watching me, waiting for a reaction, but everyone was just going about their business, like nothing weird had happened. I glanced over the partitions and cubicles, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. At first, I thought it might be a joke. Maybe someone in the office had a strange sense of humor, or maybe it was a way of welcoming the new person. But the more I looked at the photo, the more uneasy I felt. The angle was precise, taken from the side so that you could see everything on my desk, but still make out my face and expression. It wasn't a selfie. It was taken without me knowing, at some random moment when I was just working. I started running through the possibilities. Who would have done this? I didn't know anyone at work well enough for a prank like this, and none of my coworkers had ever shown that kind of sense of humor. I thought about going to HR, but what would I even say? It was just a photo, nothing overtly threatening. But that note taped to the back? I couldn't ignore it. It felt like a warning, like someone was trying to let me know they'd been watching, and that they could keep watching whenever they wanted. I didn't bring it up with anyone, and I tried to shake it off as best as I could. I put the frame in my drawer, trying to forget about it. But the thought of that photo sat at the back of my mind all day. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, scanning the office to see if anyone was watching me or even glancing my way. A couple of days later, I was alone in the office catching up on some work before the holiday break officially started. It was quiet, and most people had left early, so I felt a little better about being there. I convinced myself it had all been a joke, maybe from someone who thought it would be funny. But as I was packing up to leave, I noticed something else on my desk that hadn't been there when I came in that morning. It was another note, this time just a small piece of paper, folded in half and placed directly on top of my keyboard. I opened it, and in the same messy handwriting it read, "You looked nice today." I stared at the note, a chill running down my spine. I'd been in the office alone for most of the day, and I hadn't seen anyone come by my desk. The doors were locked when I arrived, and I knew I'd been the first one in that morning. I started to feel like someone was playing some kind of sick game, trying to get under my skin. I couldn't understand why anyone would go through the trouble, though. I'd barely talked to anyone outside of my immediate team, and there was nothing about me that would have made me a target for something like this. I looked around the empty office, my eyes darting to every corner, expecting someone to jump out or laugh, but it was completely silent. The building was dim, the kind of quiet where every tiny noise is amplified. I hurried out of there, feeling like someone was watching me the whole time. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying everything in my mind. I thought about the note and the picture, wondering if I'd missed something, if there had been some clue I'd overlooked. The whole situation was starting to mess with my head, but I didn't know what to do. I felt like I'd seem paranoid if I told anyone, so I kept it to myself. When I got back to work after the break, things seemed normal again. The picture and the notes were gone, and I tried to convince myself it had been some one-time prank. I settled back into my routine, feeling a little more at ease, though I still caught myself looking over my shoulder every now and then. A few weeks later, another gift showed up on my desk, wrapped in the same festive paper as the first one. My hands were shaking as I opened it, half expecting another creepy photo or note. But this time, it was different. Inside was a small box, and when I lifted the lid, I found a single USB drive, unlabeled and plain. I didn't want to plug it into my computer, afraid of what might be on it, but I couldn't stop myself. I went to an empty meeting room, closed the door, and plugged it into one of the shared laptops. There was only one file on the drive, a video file labeled with my name. I opened it, my heart pounding, and the video started playing. It was a clip from one of the security cameras in the office, showing me sitting at my desk, typing away. The timestamp was from a few days before Christmas, the day I'd found the photo on my desk. The video showed me working, unaware of the camera recording, for about a minute. Then, something shifted in the background. A person, dressed in all black with a hood pulled low over their face, entered the frame. They moved quickly and silently, placing the wrapped box on my desk. I could barely make out their face, but they looked up at the camera for just a split second before disappearing from view. Their face was mostly covered, but I could see the faint hint of a smirk. They knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted me to see this. I deleted the video, threw the USB drive in the trash, and sat there, my mind racing. I knew now that someone in the office was messing with me, but I didn't know who to trust or who to turn to. No one else seemed to know anything about it, and I didn't want to come across as paranoid or accuse someone without proof. After that, I started keeping my head down, trying to avoid being in the office alone or staying late. The strange gifts stopped, and life slowly went back to normal, but that image of the hooded figure looking up at the camera still haunts me. I kept getting calls from a blocked number every night at midnight. It all started last December. I just moved into my own place in Chicago, a one-bedroom apartment in Logan Square, a spot I'd been lucky to find. I was settling in, getting used to the quiet, and all seemed pretty normal. Then, mid-December, the calls started. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was around midnight, and I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, fighting off sleep like I usually do. Out of nowhere, my phone lit up with an incoming call. It wasn't a number I recognized, and it was marked as no caller ID. I didn't think too hard about it. Probably a spam call or a telemarketer with some trick to get around the block. So I let it ring, and eventually, it stopped. No message, no text, just silence. The next night, around the same time, it happened again. Midnight on the dot. I was brushing my teeth, just about to go to bed, and the call came in. I almost picked it up just to tell them to knock it off, but I decided not to. It felt weird, and I don't usually mess with unknown numbers. When I didn't answer, the ringing just stopped, just like before. But this time, I felt an odd twinge of unease. I thought maybe it was a glitch in the system, some automated call gone haywire, so I brushed it off again. But it didn't stop. The calls kept coming, and every time it was at midnight, never a minute before or after. Sometimes, I'd be lying in bed, sometimes scrolling online or watching a show, and the call would come in. Each time, I'd stare at the screen for a second, debating, and then decide to ignore it. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I'd get tired of it eventually, and they'd stop. But then, one night, curiosity got the best of me. It was around midnight again, and the no-caller ID lit up on my screen, just like every other time. Only this time, I couldn't resist. I pressed answer and put the phone to my ear. Silence. There was no voice, no static, nothing. Just this silence on the other end that felt heavy, like someone was there listening, and then, faintly, almost so quietly I wondered if I was imagining it, I could hear breathing. Slow and steady, like someone was deliberately holding the phone close. I sat there, holding my breath, my heart starting to race a bit, and then, just as quietly as it came, the call ended. I didn't sleep much that night. I tried to shrug it off the next day, convincing myself that it was a prank or some kind of scam. But it didn't make sense. Who would go to that much trouble just to sit there in silence, breathing? And why at midnight every single night? Over the next week, the calls kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. By now I was freaked out enough that I'd stopped picking up, but I could still feel my nerves getting stretched every time my phone lit up at midnight. I didn't want to answer anymore, but the not knowing was starting to wear on me. I'd lie awake afterward listening to the sounds in my apartment, feeling jumpy at every creak and groan of the old building. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that it was just my nerves. But that didn't make it easier. One night, though, I decided enough was enough. I blocked the unknown calls and turned my phone off before going to bed. I figured if I just shut it all out, maybe whoever it was would give up and leave me alone. I'd never dealt with anything like this before, and I honestly thought that blocking the calls would solve the problem. But that night, just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard it. A faint rhythmic tapping on my window. I live on the 3rd floor, so right away my brain went into overdrive trying to rationalize it. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, staring at the window. Maybe it was just a branch blowing in the wind, or something else outside that I couldn't see in the darkness. But as I listened, the tapping continued. Soft, steady, and deliberate. I was frozen, unable to move or breathe, just listening to that faint, steady sound. After a few minutes, it stopped. I sat there in the silence, straining to hear anything else. I don't know how long I stayed that way, but eventually I convinced myself that I was imagining things, that it was just the stress of the calls getting to me. I was finally able to lie down, but I barely slept, jumping at every sound, every shift in the shadows. The next morning, I hesitated before looking out the window, half expecting to find something unusual. I don't know what I was expecting really, but there was nothing. No branches close enough to cause the noise, no signs of anything unusual. I felt like I was losing it, and I was more anxious than ever. The worst part was that blocking the number hadn't helped at all. The calls kept coming, even after I'd tried to cut them off. A few nights later, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more persistent. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I couldn't hear it, but it was impossible to block out. I couldn't take it anymore. I forced myself to get out of bed and move toward the window, heart pounding, hands shaking. I pulled back the curtain, expecting to see nothing but darkness. But there was something there, something small, dark, taped to the outside of my window. It was a piece of paper, folded neatly, stuck there like some kind of message. I opened the window just enough to reach it, grabbed it with shaking hands, and quickly shut the window again. I stood there in the darkness, unfolding it slowly, almost afraid to see what it said. There was no writing, no message, just a crude sketch of a face with empty eyes and a wide, hollow smile. The sight of it made my stomach turn, and I crumpled it up immediately, wanting to be rid of it. I was terrified by then. I started keeping my windows locked and double-checking everything before going to bed. I stopped answering unknown calls altogether, and considered changing my number, though part of me worried it wouldn't make a difference. I felt trapped in my own apartment, constantly on edge, waiting for the next call, or knock, or whatever else was coming next. A few days before Christmas, I went to a friend's holiday party, desperate for a distraction. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably just a random prank. But when I came home that night, exhausted and a little buzzed, I found something waiting for me at my front door. A small envelope, taped to the doorframe, with my name written on it in red ink. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to gather the courage to open it. I could feel my hands shaking as I tore the envelope open, half dreading what I'd find inside. There was no note, just a small piece of paper with a simple, chilling message. Merry Christmas, Robert. Asterisk, asterisk. That was it. I didn't even bother looking around. I just bolted inside and locked every single door and window I could find. I spent that night curled up on the couch, jumping at every noise, every creak in the apartment. I kept my phone close, even though I knew I wouldn't answer if they called again. That night, for the first time in weeks, there was no call. Last year, I spent Christmas Eve at my sister's place in Cleveland. She lives about half an hour from my apartment in Lakewood, and our family always gets together on Christmas Eve for dinner. I left my place around 5, planning to stay for a few hours and get home before midnight since I had work the next day. My apartment complex is old, but I like it. It has a bit of character, with brick walls and vintage-style fixtures, and it's tucked away on a quieter street where I feel like I have some privacy. I'm careful about keeping my doors locked, especially because I live on the first floor. I've never had any issues with the area, but I'm still cautious. Before I left that evening, I double-checked the door and gave it an extra pull to make sure it was locked. Dinner at my sister's was nice, though I didn't stay as late as usual. Around 10 p.m., I grabbed my coat, said my goodbyes, and started heading home. The drive was quiet, with hardly any cars on the road, and I was looking forward to a hot shower and getting into bed. It was freezing that night, and all I could think about was getting inside and warming up. But as I pulled into my apartment complex, I noticed something strange. The light in my living room window was on. I almost never leave lights on when I go out. I don't remember specifically turning it off, but I was pretty sure I had. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, it could have been a simple slip-up. But as I got closer to my apartment door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The door was slightly open. It was only a crack, but it was enough for me to see that it hadn't been shut properly. I just stood there for a second, feeling my heartbeat pick up. I knew I'd locked it. I distinctly remembered double-checking, but there it was, slightly ajar, almost like it was waiting for me to come back. I thought about calling the building's security, but something in me felt silly. I tried to convince myself that maybe I'd just left it unlocked in a rush, though that didn't feel right. So, I took a deep breath, gently pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow from the living room lamp. Everything looked normal at first glance. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. But as I took a few steps in, I noticed something that definitely hadn't been there when I left. A Santa hat. It was sitting right on the armrest of my couch, almost like someone had placed it there deliberately. It was an ordinary hat, but I didn't own one, and I knew for a fact it hadn't been there earlier. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced through a dozen different explanations, each one worse than the last. Maybe someone had been in my apartment. Maybe they were still here, hiding somewhere, watching me. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was no one. I thought about leaving, but the stubborn part of me didn't want to be chased out of my own home. I took a deep breath, went over to the kitchen, and grabbed the heaviest knife I could find. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears as I started moving through the apartment, checking each room. I looked in the bathroom, checked the closet, and even peeked under the bed, but there was nothing. No signs of anyone or anything unusual, just that Santa hat sitting there on the couch like it belonged. I went back to the living room staring at the hat, trying to make sense of it. I reached out and picked it up, half expecting some sort of message inside. There was nothing, just an ordinary cheap hat, a little dusty, like it had been tossed around. I was completely unnerved but still trying to rationalize. Maybe one of my friends had found a way in and left it as a prank, but none of them had keys. I had no ex who would do something like this, no one who'd try to mess with me for the fun of it. I was about to toss the hat when something else caught my eye. On the kitchen counter, next to my mail and some unopened bills, was a small, folded piece of paper. I knew it wasn't mine. I hadn't left anything like that out. My hands were shaking as I reached for it, and I could feel this cold dread settle over me as I opened it. In neat handwriting it read, "I just wanted to see how you celebrate." I can't describe the feeling that washed over me as I read those words. Someone had been in my apartment, left a note, and taken absolutely nothing. There were no signs of rummaging, no drawers left open, no valuables missing, just that creepy note and the Santa hat. I felt sick, like my entire body was on edge, and I almost ran out the door right then and there. But again, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Instead, I sat down on the couch staring at that stupid hat, trying to figure out who would do something like this. I couldn't think of a single person in my life who'd find this funny. I ended up locking myself in my bedroom that night, with my phone and the knife next to me, just in case. The next morning, I called the building management and told them what happened. They were sympathetic, but they didn't have much to offer other than to check the locks and make sure everything was secure. They didn't have cameras in the hallways, and since there wasn't any forced entry, there was nothing they could really do. I changed the locks anyway, hoping it would give me some peace of mind. Over the next few weeks, I tried to put it behind me. I went through the motions, went to work, and tried not to think about it. But every time I came home, I'd feel a little on edge, wondering if something else would be waiting for me. I stopped going out as much, especially after dark. I didn't tell many people about it because I didn't want to sound paranoid or like I was overreacting. But the whole thing left me with this gnawing sense of unease. A month went by without incident, and I was starting to think maybe it was a one-off prank, someone's twisted idea of a joke. I even put the Santa hat and the note in a box and stuffed it in the back of my closet, thinking that if I ignored it, it would lose its power to bother me. Then, one night in February, I came home late from a work event. I was tired, a little buzzed, and all I wanted was to fall into bed. But as soon as I stepped into my apartment, I knew something was off. The light in the kitchen was on, even though I was sure I'd turned it off before I left. I stood there in the doorway, feeling that familiar sense of dread creeping back. I didn't want to believe that someone had been inside again, but I couldn't ignore the feeling. I walked slowly into the kitchen, scanning the room, looking for anything out of place. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I saw it. Sitting on the counter next to my keys was another note. This one was shorter, just 2 words, written in the same neat handwriting as before. Missed you. I felt this chill run down my spine as I read it, and I was too stunned to move at first. This wasn't a prank, not some random joke. Someone had been in my home again, deliberately leaving these notes, as if they were keeping tabs on me, letting me know they'd been watching. I didn't sleep that night. I ended up calling a friend to stay with me for a few days because I couldn't handle being alone. I thought about moving, about breaking my lease, but I was stuck in this lease for another 6 months, and breaking it wasn't an option financially. For the rest of the winter, I lived in a state of hypervigilance. Every time I walked into my apartment, I'd scan each room, checking every corner. I got a few more notes over the following weeks, each one brief, cryptic, and unsettling in its own way. There was never any sign of forced entry, nothing ever taken or moved. Just these notes left like someone was marking their territory. I told the building manager again, and they promised to look into it, but without any concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. Eventually, the notes stopped coming, and I hadn't received anything new since. My brother went missing one winter and we never found him. It was a few years ago, but I still remember everything like it was yesterday. Every time December rolls around, the memories come creeping back, settling over me like a thick fog. My brother David disappeared one winter, right before Christmas, and no one ever found him. It was supposed to be a regular family outing, something we did every year, but that day turned into something straight out of a nightmare. Growing up in a small town in Washington, we didn't have many big stores nearby, and my family had this tradition of going out to a remote spot in the forests around Olympia to cut down our own Christmas tree. For years, it had just been me, my brother, and my parents, bundling up against the cold, trudging through the forest, and picking the perfect tree. We'd drag it back to the car, haul it home, and decorate it together. It was something we looked forward to, a simple but solid tradition that marked the start of the holiday season. That year, David offered to go out on his own to find the tree. It was a Saturday morning, and he had some reason, I don't remember exactly, but he said he wanted to head out early. My parents and I planned to meet him there later. He took the family's old truck, promising to pick out the best tree and joking that he'd do all the hard work so we could just show up and admire his choice. It was a gray morning, but that wasn't unusual. In the Pacific Northwest, gray skies and mist are just part of life. By noon, though, he still hadn't come back. We didn't think much of it at first, figuring he might have just taken his time to find the right tree or maybe decided to explore a bit. David was always the type to wander, getting lost in his thoughts, especially in the woods, which he loved. But as the hours ticked by, my mom started to worry. I remember the look on her face as she kept glancing out the window, clutching her phone, waiting for him to text back. She tried calling him a few times, but it went straight to voicemail. Eventually, my dad decided we'd go out to find him ourselves. I still remember how quickly my mom got her coat and boots on, like she was already halfway out the door. We loaded up some snacks, water, and extra jackets, thinking maybe he'd just gotten a bit lost or sidetracked. When we arrived at the spot where we usually park the car, David's truck was there, just sitting quietly by the road. I remember that eerie, silent feeling, like something was off but I couldn't put my finger on it. His truck was locked, and there was no sign of him around. We called his name a few times, then started walking in the direction he'd probably gone. The ground was covered in fallen leaves and a bit of frost, and as we went deeper into the trees, the temperature seemed to drop. It was that kind of cold that just sinks into your bones. We kept calling his name, but there was no answer, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird taking off somewhere above us. After a while, I felt this heavy sense of dread, like I was holding my breath and waiting for something to happen. I didn't say anything to my parents, though. They were already worried enough. Then, after maybe an hour of searching, we found his jacket. It was hanging on a low branch, like he draped it there intentionally. His phone was in the pocket, which was weird. David never went anywhere without his phone. He was the kind of person who always needed it close by, especially if he was going out into the woods alone. The battery was dead, so we couldn't check any recent calls or messages, and there was nothing in the phone that would give us any idea where he'd gone. The area where we found the jacket was strange. It was deep in the forest, farther than we'd ever gone before, and it wasn't on any path we recognized. It felt almost untouched, like no one had been there in a long time. My dad called the local police to report David missing, and they sent out a search team pretty quickly, given the circumstances. I spent that whole night lying in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the house, hoping David would just walk through the door like nothing had happened. But the hours dragged on, and the silence felt heavier as time passed. The police search lasted for days. They brought dogs, drones, and even helicopters to scan the forest, but nothing turned up. It was like David had just vanished. I remember the look in my mom's eyes, this sort of numbness that replaced the worry, like she was shutting down. My dad didn't say much either. He just sat by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. The house felt empty, and every little thing reminded us of him. The jacket he left behind, his empty room, even the truck we'd parked back in the garage. The days started to blur together. People from town dropped by with casseroles, flowers, and sad looks. The police eventually scaled back the search, saying they'd done all they could. They told us to keep hoping, that maybe he'd just gone off somewhere and would come back on his own. But deep down, I think we all knew that wasn't true. David wouldn't just disappear like that. Christmas came, and we didn't even bother with a tree. The living room looked bare, and the house was silent in a way that felt wrong. Every time I went outside, I found myself glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see David coming out of the trees with that same grin he always had after one of his solo adventures. But there was nothing, just the quiet weight of the forest pressing down on us. Months passed, then a year, and life sort of moved on, but in a different way. It felt like we were just going through the motions. My mom got into the habit of leaving a light on by the front door, like she was still waiting for him to come home. My dad spent more time at work, burying himself in projects to keep his mind off things. I tried to keep busy with school and friends, but every time I saw a missing person flyer or read about someone getting lost in the woods, it brought everything rushing back. The police checked in with us from time to time, but there were no new leads, no signs of foul play, nothing to go on. It's like he just slipped away into the trees and was swallowed up by them. People would say things like, maybe he just wanted a fresh start, or maybe he got lost and couldn't find his way back. But none of that ever sat right with me. David was smart, careful, and he knew those woods better than anyone. It's been a few years now, but I still think about him whenever I see a forest. I can't help but wonder what happened that day, what he saw or heard that made him leave his jacket behind and walk off without his phone.
Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.